A struggling farmer on the verge of losing everything finds a lost boy deep in the forest. He saves the child, unaware that he's the son of a powerful tech billionaire. Days later, a convoy of black SUVs pulls up to the farm. A mysterious businessman offers a deal that could rescue the land. But the price is change, the kind the farmer has always feared. The farmer must choose, cling to the past, or build a future. Stay with us to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe, even more powerful stories are coming your way. Ethan Cole had always risen before first light, making his way through the dim hallway of his old farmhouse with careful steps, hoping not to stir the aging planks beneath his feet. Each morning, the silence reminded him of how much of his past was tied to this place, perched on the fringes of Redwood Valley, where the forest seemed an unending tapestry of towering pines and ancient oaks. For 3 generations, the Cole family had worked the land, coaxing vegetables, grains, and a modest orchard into a harvest that could sustain them through lean seasons. Yet times had grown hard. Erratic weather and shifting markets meant he was now walking a precarious tightrope between preserving his family's heritage and losing everything to overdue loans. As he made his way outside, the damp, pre-dawn air pressed gently on him, carrying the faint hint of pine resin and moist soil. He stepped onto the porch, letting a hand rest against the railing, feeling a quiet ache that ran deeper than his bones. Though pride kept him from acknowledging it aloud, the farm was in trouble. Just the day before, a letter from the local bank had arrived. There had been a short note from an acquaintance, as well, warning him that any extension on his loan seemed unlikely. The news had weighed heavily on him, but in the tradition of his father and grandfather, Ethan pressed on, resolved to keep Redwood Farm functioning. He told himself there was always a way forward, especially if he rose early enough and worked late enough. He moved across the yard, heading for the small shed where he stored his tools, only to find a message from his sister on his phone. Lily Cole was a schoolteacher in a nearby town, always offering a helping hand whenever she caught wind of Ethan's struggles. She had grown used to hearing him politely decline her financial assistance or any attempt to lessen his load. She had once argued that pride could be as destructive as any storm. Still, Ethan carried an unwavering belief that independence was essential to honor the legacy of their parents. He had lost track of how many times he had repeated to Lily that Redwood Farm was more than just a property, it was practically an extension of the family itself. After listening to her recent voicemail, which conveyed concern and a gentle mention of lending him money, he slipped the phone back into his pocket, exhaling a tense breath. The day's chores lay ahead, feeding the livestock, checking the orchard for any signs of disease, and preparing the fields for a hopeful planting of late-season vegetables. A few hours later, he maneuvered his aging tractor along the property's edges, performing a cursory inspection. The sun had begun to rise, casting a silver glow through the slender branches of pine trees along the perimeter. Ethan noticed a slight disturbance at the edge of the forest. At first, he assumed it might be a deer or a raccoon rummaging for an early meal. But something felt different, he sensed an unusual tension in the air. Nonetheless, he turned his attention back to the farm, dismissing it as one more quirk of nature. For a while, he immersed himself in tasks that demanded all his focus, though a persistent unease lingered, causing him to glance toward the tree line now and then. Late that afternoon, as a soft drizzle began to fall, Ethan found himself trudging back to the farmhouse. The air had turned cooler, and he welcomed the drizzle as a potential relief for parched soil. He was met by a stiff breeze rattling the upper branches of the orchard trees, causing a few unripe apples to drop onto the grass. He wondered if the weather would escalate to one of the storms that had plagued the valley the previous year. Those storms had done more than just damage the crops, they had threatened his sense of stability and left him doubting how much longer he could keep Redwood Farm in his hands. He spent the evening repairing a broken fence post, ignoring the light rain. His thoughts drifted to Lily's repeated offers of help. He recalled the time she had driven all the way from her place, determined to hand him a check that would cover at least a fraction of the mounting debts. He had turned her down. Telling her with stiff resolve that the land was his responsibility alone, that he did not want anyone else burdened by it. She had left that day with tears threatening to fall, but she had respected his decision. Sometimes, though, Ethan wondered whether his pride was hurting more than it was helping. Night settled in, and the forest beyond the farm became a dark wall, pulsing with cricket songs and distant rustling. Ethan tried to get some rest, though sleep often proved elusive in recent months. He drifted in and out of uneasy dreams, only to wake in the pre-dawn hours, haunted by half-remembered scenes of debt collectors and decaying barns. The next morning, a call from the local hardware store reminded him that several bills were still overdue. He promised them he would settle his account soon, hanging up with the weight of frustration pressing him harder. He decided to walk along the tree line to clear his thoughts, letting the cool morning air revitalize him. It was around then that he discovered fresh footprints, small in size, leading from an old hunting trail deeper into the forest. He paused, uncertain of what he was seeing. The footprints were distinctly child-sized, yet no local families had been to the farm in weeks. Alarmed, he followed them for a short distance, calling out in a cautious tone, though he expected no response. He had never known of anyone venturing onto his land without permission, especially a child. The prints vanished after a short distance, swallowed by thicker vegetation and wet leaves. Ethan could not simply ignore them, so he returned to the house, grabbed a flashlight, and decided to conduct a search. Even though the sun was climbing, the dense canopy often blocked out much of the light. He needed a reliable beam to illuminate any sign of movement or footprints. Hours passed as he waded through brambles and uneven terrain, occasionally glimpsing broken twigs or muddy scuff marks that might have indicated a lost traveler. Unease grew inside him, fueled by the idea that someone's child might be wandering in the labyrinth of redwood forest, possibly frightened or hurt. As he ventured deeper, the atmosphere changed. The hush of the tall pines seemed to envelop him, broken only by his own footfalls on the damp ground. He paused once to check his phone. The signal was faint, but the battery icon glowed with a disheartening emptiness. He persisted, stepping over roots and through clusters of ferns, calling out in a firm but gentle tone that, if a child were there, they might respond. A little after midday, he was about to turn around and head back for supplies, feeling a sting of hopelessness. Then he spotted a blur of red fabric clinging to the bark of a fallen tree. Stepping closer, he realized it was indeed a child's windbreaker, smeared with mud. That discovery renewed his determination. The presence of the jacket meant its owner was nearby or might have moved further into the forest. He continued, each footstep more purposeful, scanning the ground and the spaces between the trees. Within minutes, he spotted a small figure huddled at the base of a towering oak, as if trying to vanish into the trunk. The child was trembling, arms hugging his knees. Ethan could see that the boy, who appeared no older than 8 or 9, was exhausted and shivering. Without pausing to consider his own fatigue, Ethan approached slowly. He spoke gently in a calm, steady manner, hoping to ease the boy's obvious distress. The child's eyes were wide, brimming with fear and tears. Although Ethan did not hear direct words, he could sense the boy was disoriented and possibly injured, given the grimace he wore when trying to shift position. Ethan removed his light jacket and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. He knelt down to examine a scrape on the child's leg, noticing the torn fabric around the boy's pants. It appeared the youngster might have slipped on a wet rock or tripped over an exposed root. Ethan scooped him up gently, alert to any sign of a more serious injury, then steeled himself for the trek back. He reasoned he could get the boy to the farmhouse, clean his wound, and call the authorities. It was a long walk, made more difficult by the thick undergrowth and uncertain weather. As the hours wore on, the boy clung to Ethan, letting out an occasional soft sob but otherwise remaining silent. Eventually, they emerged from the dense forest onto a clearing near Redwood Farm. By then, the boy was completely exhausted. Ethan hurried to the farmhouse, his arms and back aching from the effort, yet his main concern was for the child's safety. Once inside, he set the boy down on a worn couch and rushed to gather a first aid kit. While cleaning the wound, Ethan noticed signs of dehydration. He made sure the child drank water, and though the boy was still shaken, he appeared to trust that he was now safe. As Ethan tidied up, he spotted something in the boy's pocket, a slip of paper with a phone number and the name Oliver Beck. Though Ethan respected the child's privacy, the presence of that note was crucial for contacting family or the authorities. He stepped outside with his phone, finding only a single bar of service, enough to try a call. Before he could complete the dial, the device powered down, the battery finally depleted. With no immediate way to call for help from his location, he realized he would need to drive into town. He returned to Oliver, offering a few reassuring words without employing direct quotations. The child seemed calmer now, nibbling on a piece of bread Ethan had handed him. Because Redwood Farm was isolated, and the old truck's reliability was questionable at best, Ethan was unsure if heading out right away was safe. The truck had a tendency to stall unexpectedly, and the prospect of being stranded on a back road with an injured child weighed heavily on his mind. He decided it was better to wait until early morning to make the trip, allowing both the boy and himself a chance to rest. That night, Ethan hardly slept. He kept checking on Oliver, draping a second blanket over him. Through the window, the forest loomed dark and silent, as though guarding whatever secrets had led the boy there. At dawn, Ethan readied the truck, double-checked the engine fluids, and prepared a small bag of supplies. Oliver seemed more alert, yet he remained quiet, letting Ethan know indirectly that he was fearful of returning to the place where he had become lost. With no alternative, Ethan guided him into the truck, securing him as best he could with the frayed seat belts. The road into the nearest town meandered along steep hillsides, occasionally providing glimpses of a shimmering river in the valley below. Ethan could sense the tension in the child, though he avoided pressing for details, waiting until Oliver felt secure enough to volunteer them. Part of him worried about what might happen once they reached town. He suspected the boy's parents were likely worried sick, but there was also a chance they were powerful or influential, and he himself had never been comfortable dealing with authority figures. Financial woes had a way of making any official interaction feel like a risk. Upon arriving at the small medical clinic on the outskirts of Redwood Valley's modest downtown, Ethan spoke quietly with the staff. They agreed to examine the boy's injuries, and though they gently asked for insurance or contact details, Ethan could only provide the child's name and the slip of paper he had found. He could not confirm anything further. The staff seemed sympathetic, focusing on caring for Oliver instead of pressing for immediate paperwork. While a nurse led the boy away, Ethan used one of the clinic's phones to call the number on the paper. An unfamiliar voice answered, sounding urgent and alarmed. Ethan explained who he was and gave a concise account of the situation, including where Oliver could be found. Not long after, a dark, sleek SUV pulled up in front of the clinic. An imposing figure stepped out, accompanied by two individuals who appeared to be assistants or perhaps security personnel. Ethan remained in the waiting area, feeling distinctly out of place in his mud-caked boots and threadbare jacket. He watched as the tall figure rushed to see Oliver, who had just been cleared of any serious injuries but was given instructions for rest. From the hushed conversation, Ethan gathered that the man was Leonard Beck, and he had indeed been searching for his son for nearly a day. He seemed visibly relieved, though he carried himself with a composed, authoritative air. Ethan expected a brief word of thanks, perhaps. Instead, he was quietly asked to remain for a few more minutes while Oliver was settled. He could sense that Leonard Beck was someone of considerable means, someone used to coordinating staff and resources with a single phone call. Ethan glanced down at his worn-out boots, feeling a wave of self-consciousness wash over him. He reminded himself that he had done only what any decent person would do when discovering a lost child in the woods. Once the initial frenzy subsided, a staff member pointed Ethan toward an empty hallway, gesturing for him to wait. He stood there, arms folded, uncertain of what would come next. Eventually, Leonard Beck approached with a subdued but intense expression. The man wore clothes that bore the mark of high-end tailoring. He appeared the sort who might own multiple businesses or oversee large teams of employees. There was an unspoken tension in the air, as though something beyond a mere thank you was on the horizon. Ethan gave a simple explanation of how he had found Oliver, leaving out the specifics of his own worries and the farm's challenges. Leonard Beck listened intently, then conveyed appreciation in measured tones, acknowledging that the child had been camping with family friends when he wandered off. The group had called in a search team but had not expanded the search perimeter soon enough to reach Redwood Farm. Ethan nodded, relieved to hear the boy had not been alone for long, though it was still long enough to be dangerous. The forest could be unforgiving, especially to a child. Without pressing too deeply, Leonard asked where Ethan lived. The mention of Redwood Farm elicited a polite but curious reaction, as though Leonard recognized the name. Ethan wondered if the man had heard rumors about the farmland state. The notion of Redwood Farm being in dire financial straits was common gossip in the region. Something about Leonard's posture suggested that he was already forming ideas, though nothing was stated outright. Ethan left the clinic with a promise that the boy's parents would be in touch, stepping out into the gray morning with a sense of conflicting emotions. He had done something important, something good, but he had also opened a door to unknown consequences. Once behind the wheel of his old truck, he tried not to dwell on those possibilities, returning home to his list of chores and obligations. Back at Redwood Farm, the tasks seemed more relentless than ever. Heavy rains had battered the region for weeks, stunting the growth of the crops and endangering the orchard. In the past, Ethan would have fallen back on the stable relationships his family had forged with the local bank, but those days were gone. He found a notice pinned to his door that afternoon, reminding him of an impending deadline on his loan. It stung worse than usual, perhaps because he had tasted a sense of triumph that morning, helping a child in need. Now the weight of reality had returned, heavier than ever. He spent the rest of the day in silent labor, mending parts of a busted irrigation system, trying to assess if the fields could support a late harvest. The hours slipped away until the sun began its descent behind the towering pines, painting the sky with streaks of orange and violet. All the while, Ethan replayed the events of the last 24 hours, remembering the fear etched on that child's face. Though Redwood Farm was threatened by forces beyond Ethan's control, the simple act of saving a life felt like a confirmation of his grandfather's old saying that good deeds had a way of coming full circle. In the lingering twilight, Ethan found himself peering toward the far edge of the property, where the forest began. He recalled the missing footprints that had set the day's events in motion. It felt as if the forest had offered him a chance to do something meaningful, even as it demanded its toll in the form of hours of labor and more worry over how to keep the farm afloat. Tired as he was, Ethan resolved to keep going. The land was part of his legacy, and he believed that perseverance had defined every Cole who had ever walked these fields. Late that evening, he sat at the worn kitchen table, poring over financial records and weather forecasts. The next round of storms was predicted to be fierce, raising the possibility that the orchard could sustain heavy damage. He tried to calculate if he had enough resources to protect the orchard with tarps or temporary reinforcements, but the costs seemed overwhelming. It occurred to him that a corporate entity, if it ever had an interest in Redwood Farm, would have easily taken these steps. Money could resolve many obstacles. The irony was not lost on him, especially after encountering Leonard Beck, who evidently came from a world where resources were abundant. By the time Ethan climbed into bed, the weight of the day pressed upon him in full force. He closed his eyes, hearing in his mind the faint echo of the boy's unspoken gratitude and feeling a sense of solace in having done the right thing, even if it offered no immediate relief for his own troubles. The next morning dawned clear but foreboding, as if the valley itself braced for another upheaval. Ethan resumed his usual routine, though he felt a twinge of anticipation at the idea that Oliver's family might reappear in his life. A part of him hoped it would remain a simple matter of the child's safe return. Another part couldn't help imagining that fate might have set this encounter in motion for reasons he could not yet comprehend. As the day wore on, he pushed the thought aside, immersing himself in mundane tasks. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, a subtle tension underlined everything he did. Whenever he paused to catch his breath, he found himself gazing toward the dirt road leading away from his land. That was how Lily found him later in the afternoon, leaning against a fence post, lost in thought. She had driven over to check on him, her face lined with concern, but also with the quiet knowledge that Ethan was carrying burdens larger than he would ever admit. He braced himself for another exchange about finances, possibly culminating in his refusal of her help. Instead, Lily seemed more focused on the story she had heard from the nurse at the clinic. News of the lost child had traveled quickly through Redwood Valley, spreading along with the account of Ethan's rescue efforts. Though Lily was proud of him, she wanted to know how he planned to balance these acts of compassion with the cruel reality of the farm's precarious state. Ethan offered a noncommittal shrug, feeling a mixture of warmth at her concern and the familiar aggravation that always surfaced when he was reminded of Redwood Farm's financial troubles. The hours continued to drift by, culminating in a quiet evening that found Ethan going through the same mental loop, hovering between pride in saving Oliver and worry about the future. He slept restlessly, listening to the wind whistling outside. When he awoke before dawn once more, he had the distinct sense that something significant was about to happen. His intuition was confirmed not long after sunrise, when a line of vehicles appeared on the horizon, rolling down the dusty country road leading to Redwood Farm. Ethan watched from a distance as the procession of vehicles drew nearer, kicking up a low cloud of dust in the otherwise still morning air. He counted at least 4, possibly 5 SUVs, each with dark-tinted windows that glinted in the early light. The sight of them set his nerves on edge. Few visitors ever made their way this far off the beaten path, and those who did typically arrived in 1 or 2 trucks at most. A gathering like this felt more in line with politicians or corporate executives, neither of which offered Ethan much comfort in that moment. Despite his unease, he stood his ground, refusing to retreat into the barn or house. Whatever was coming, he intended to meet it head-on. When the lead vehicle halted just beyond the gate, Ethan took a few steps forward. He noticed that the others lined up behind it in a neat row, their engines idling quietly. The first door opened and out stepped Leonard Beck, who carried himself with a blend of urgency and composure. He scanned the property, his eyes settling on Ethan in a way that suggested he remembered every detail of their brief conversation at the clinic. Several individuals emerged from the other SUVs, some holding tablets or folders, their faces as impassive as the vehicles themselves. Ethan allowed a flicker of relief to cross his mind at not seeing any uniformed officers. He doubted that the arrival of a corporate entourage signaled a pleasant day, but it seemed a step better than facing immediate repossession or foreclosure representatives. Leonard approached with a measured stride, pausing at the gate as if mindful of some unspoken boundary. Ethan studied him in the morning light, seeing more evidence of wealth in his attire and the watch that gleamed under the sun. There was a muted tension to his expression, reflecting both his gratitude for Ethan's help in finding Oliver and a serious purpose behind his unannounced visit. Ethan saw no child this time. He guessed that Oliver was recovering at home or perhaps with other family members. The staff who accompanied Leonard moved with an efficiency that reminded Ethan of televised business segments he had watched when static plagued most other channels. They seemed used to orchestrating logistics and answering to a single commanding voice. Ethan could sense that Leonard was waiting for a signal to enter, so he swung open the gate with deliberate calm. He felt strangely exposed, as if Redwood Farm itself stood under scrutiny. The land stretched behind him, a tapestry of rolling fields and scattered outbuildings, all showing signs of prolonged wear. Even the distant orchard, once a symbol of his family's hope, bore stripped branches and a patchy canopy. In that moment, Ethan felt as though the entire farm's condition weighed upon him like an accusation: the half-repaired fences, the battered silo, the equipment rusting away in the open. He forced himself to recall his grandfather's optimism, the idea that one could build anew from almost any setback if there was enough grit and determination. Once a subtle greeting passed between them, Leonard began asking pointed questions about the farm. He did so calmly, never raising his voice, yet cutting swiftly to the heart of each matter. He inquired about the acreage, what crops Ethan typically grew, and how the orchard had weathered the most recent series of storms. Ethan answered as directly as he could without veering into the realm of his debts or the precarious nature of the farm's finances. He was wary of revealing too much, especially to someone who seemed accustomed to forging deals with a stroke of a pen. Part of him wanted to express anger that this man had arrived without an invitation, but deep down, he understood it was better to discover Leonard's intentions before rushing to judgment. Those intentions soon became clearer. Leonard nodded toward his associates, who promptly began taking photos of the property with high-end cameras. He motioned for them to examine the irrigation setup, or what remained of it. A few ventured toward the orchard with small measuring devices, and one hovered near the barn, typing notes rapidly on a tablet. Seeing them move about so systematically filled Ethan with a mix of dread and resignation. He could no longer deny that Redwood Farm had caught the eye of someone with the means to alter its fate, for better or worse. The group eventually clustered back around Leonard, who turned to face Ethan. The subtle tilt of Leonard's head and the unwavering look in his eyes reminded Ethan of a hawk scrutinizing something that might prove valuable. However, there was also an undercurrent of sincerity in the way he inclined his shoulders, an unspoken acknowledgement of the rescue Ethan had carried out. Months earlier, Ethan would have never entertained the notion that his compassion could lead to a situation like this. Yet here he was, standing on his own land, dwarfed by a gathering of outsiders who could well shape his farm's future. He felt a surge of protectiveness toward Redwood Farm, as though it were a family member in need of shelter. Leonard began speaking in carefully measured tones that carried smoothly over the hum of vehicle engines. Ethan caught phrases like mutual benefit, pilot program, and research opportunities, each hinting at some larger venture. The man explained that his corporate interests lay in advanced forestry management, sustainable agriculture, and new technologies that could help small farms maximize output with minimal environmental impact. Although he stopped short of describing his entire plan, Ethan sensed that Redwood Farm represented an ideal test site in Leonard's eyes. For years, Redwood Valley had been known for its fertile soil and relatively abundant rainfall, even if erratic weather had become a growing problem. Ethan stood quietly, letting Leonard speak. He had too many questions swirling in his mind, and he did not see how interrupting now would help. Leonard mentioned ways to improve irrigation through cutting-edge systems, referencing integrated soil sensors and automated watering schedules. He invoked the success of certain pilot farms in other regions. Whether all of it was feasible on Redwood Farm, Ethan could not say. The technology sounded expensive, and Redwood Farm had been operating on a shoestring budget for as long as he could remember. He cast a glance at the orchard, recalling how his grandfather had once set up a rudimentary gravity-fed irrigation line to keep the trees alive during a drought. It seemed almost comical to imagine high-tech sensors controlling that same orchard. The conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun, with Leonard announcing that he had urgent matters to attend to back in the city. He directed his associates to compile their findings and present a proposal within a few days. Ethan did not know how to respond, feeling that the entire exchange was more akin to a business assessment than a casual visit. He half expected to receive a list of demands on the spot. Instead, Leonard thanked him again for his role in rescuing Oliver, then slid back into the lead SUV. The vehicles pulled away in a neat procession, leaving Ethan alone at the gate, watching as the dust gradually settled. He spent a moment absorbing the silence. Only the wind whispered through the tops of the pines, and the distant sound of a cow lowing broke the hush. The entire spectacle had lasted less than an hour, but it left behind a swirl of possibilities and anxieties. Ethan found himself walking slowly to the porch, unsure of what, if anything, he should do to prepare for whatever might come next. He ran a hand along one of the wooden pillars, imagining how his father might have reacted to such a scene. Perhaps he would have stood taller, demanded specifics, or chased them away with a firm refusal. But times had changed, and Redwood Farm was on the brink of collapse. If an offer materialized, was it something Ethan could afford to refuse? He sat down on a creaking porch chair, letting the stillness of the morning settle around him. Questions overlapped in his mind. How deeply would Redwood Farm need to change to accept outside investment? Could he maintain ownership if a multinational corporation sought to implement advanced systems? Did the rescue of Oliver Beck create a sense of debt or obligation that might color any negotiations? The thought left him uneasy. He did not regret saving Oliver, that had been the right choice, one that transcended all else. Yet he now sensed that his personal ethic of independence, the very value he had clung to in refusing Lily's help, might be tested in ways he could scarcely imagine. As the day wore on, Ethan returned to his chores. The routine tasks offered a reprieve from the mental storm brewing in his head. He repaired a fallen gutter on the barn, checked the well pump for signs of malfunction, and tended to the orchard with careful hands. Each tree had its own history, planted by one family member or another. He remembered the stories behind certain rows, the pride his grandparents felt whenever a bountiful harvest coincided with a family gathering. The orchard was full of ghosts and memories, each leaf a testament to the passage of generations. Lily arrived in the late afternoon, her compact car rattling along the uneven dirt road. She stepped out cautiously, as if sensing the heaviness in the air. Although Ethan refrained from offering a direct explanation, she seemed to intuit that something had occurred. She glanced around, noticing fresh tire tracks imprinted near the gate, as well as Ethan's uncharacteristically shaken demeanor. She joined him under the shade of an ancient oak that grew near the front yard, a place they had both climbed as children. Ethan rarely brought up strangers visiting the farm, but the flurry of activity that morning left him with little choice. Keeping to his usual style of limited details and a serious tone, Ethan told Lily about Leonard's arrival and the entourage that had surveyed the land. He recounted the references to a pilot program, though he admitted he understood only fragments of what was proposed. Lily listened carefully, occasionally nodding as she processed the information. She asked whether a formal arrangement had been discussed, to which Ethan could only respond with uncertainty. Lily sighed, casting her gaze across the fields as if searching for an option that neither of them could quite articulate. The next few days brought a disquieting calm. Ethan carried on as usual, awaiting any sign from Leonard or his team. He rose before dawn to tend to the livestock, kept track of every small repair, and tried to salvage whatever he could of the orchard's diminishing yield. He also made a trip into town, where the local banker, Rhonda Caldwell, curtly reminded him of the approaching deadline. Ethan sensed that she took no pleasure in delivering such news. A few months earlier, she had quietly extended the grace period on his loan, but now the board's patience seemed to be running thin. She hinted that the land might be sold at auction if Ethan failed to produce a workable plan. Back at the farm, a gentle drizzle settled over the valley, saturating the soil and giving the distant hills a muted green sheen. The orchard leaves glistened in the misty light, momentarily masking the signs of disease and neglect. While Ethan stood in the middle of the field, scanning for any improvement, he heard the faint rumble of engines again. This time, 2 SUVs arrived, more discreetly than before, and parked at a respectful distance from the farmhouse. A man and a woman emerged, both dressed in business casual attire rather than the more imposing suits worn by Leonard's earlier group. They carried documents in leather binders, their expressions carefully neutral. Ethan approached slowly, bracing himself for the possibility that they represented the final push toward repossession. Instead, they introduced themselves as associates of Leonard Beck. They explained that they were there to evaluate the farmland in detail, verifying soil conditions, slope gradients, and water sources. They also shared some preliminary documents that outlined a partnership proposal. Instead of being asked to sell Redwood Farm outright, Ethan found himself looking at a complex arrangement, a form of collaboration in which Beck's firm would provide the technology and capital to modernize certain portions of the operation, while Ethan maintained a majority stake in ownership and day-to-day control. The document stressed sustainability and modernization, underscoring that Redwood Farm would serve as a model for similar small-scale operations if the pilot succeeded. Ethan felt a surge of conflicting emotions. The arrangement hinted at a lifeline for the farm, offering a way to settle debts and bring Redwood Farm into a new era of efficiency. Yet it also hinted at losing a measure of autonomy. He instinctively distrusted anything that arrived with so many conditions and references to corporate oversight. Still, the very idea that Redwood Farm might continue as a functioning entity gave him pause. He asked the two associates to leave the documents and grant him time to read through them carefully. They agreed without resistance, noting that they would return in a few days to discuss next steps. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself poring over pages of legal text late into the night. The language was formal, loaded with clauses and subclauses that made his head spin. Lily came by with coffee, her support unwavering, even if she did not entirely trust the corporate world either. By the light of a single lamp, they tried to make sense of each paragraph. The proposal outlined that Redwood Farm would remain in the Cole family name, while Beck's firm would install advanced irrigation lines, weather monitoring stations, and a greenhouse facility designed to optimize year-round crop production. The orchard would receive specialized care, including grafting techniques and automated pest control measures. In exchange, the farm would open its gates to researchers, journalists, and industry observers, effectively making it a demonstration site. The primary objective was to prove that new technology could revive and sustain a small farm, generating a blueprint for broader programs. The next day, Ethan found a moment to reflect by walking alone among the orchard's weathered rows. He passed tree after tree, recalling the times he and Lily had collected apples to sell at the local farmers' market. Thoughts of his grandfather came rushing back, especially how the old man had always preached a philosophy of self-reliance. Yet the landscape was different now. The marketplace had grown less forgiving, and natural disasters more frequent. Modern equipment had become a necessity, not a luxury. A part of Ethan resisted the notion of partnering with strangers, no matter how beneficial the arrangement sounded. Another part whispered that Redwood Farm was already slipping from his grasp, and pride alone would not keep it afloat. He walked until late morning, when he returned to find Lily waiting by the porch. She had a determined look in her eyes, as though she had reached a decision of her own. She shared with him a discovery she had made through an online search. Beck's company had spearheaded several successful collaborations, though some participants felt overshadowed by the corporate structure and found themselves lacking a true voice once the partnership was in full swing. Others, however, praised the program for saving their land from ruin and enabling a new generation to farm successfully. The mixed reviews left Ethan cautious. He told Lily indirectly that he had no intention of surrendering the soul of Redwood Farm to become a mere case study, but he also admitted that total independence was no longer a realistic path. While they talked, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. The weather forecast predicted heavy downpours over the next few days, a scenario that might further damage the orchard. Ethan's finances offered no real buffer against another costly disaster. If any portion of the orchard flooded again, or if a strong wind uprooted more trees, he faced the likelihood of total financial collapse. He stared at the stacks of documents on the kitchen table, feeling that time was slipping away faster than he could find solutions. By late afternoon, a gentle rain began, evolving into a steady downpour by nightfall. The power flickered a few times, until finally cutting out. Ethan lit a lantern and walked out to check the barn roof, hoping to avoid a repeat of last year's leak that ruined part of the hay. Sheets of rain battered the farm, pooling in uneven ground and saturating the already vulnerable fields. He could only imagine how the orchard fared, the fragile soil around roots possibly washing away in the storm. He felt a deep unease knowing there was little he could do at that moment but ride out the weather and hope the damage would be minimal. When morning arrived, Ethan found himself ankle-deep in mud, trudging through puddles that reflected the pale gray sky. A section of the fence by the orchard had collapsed under the weight of fallen branches. More than a dozen apples lay scattered and bruised in the mud, and several saplings had been uprooted. He bent to examine their slender trunks, feeling a surge of anger at his own helplessness. This patch of land was becoming too unpredictable, too demanding to handle without the resources to fortify it. As he gathered broken branches, he tried to envision how advanced equipment might have mitigated this damage, a possibility that seemed all too real now that an offer hovered in the background. Around mid-morning, he noticed a familiar SUV pulling up by the porch. It was one of Leonard's associates, the same man who had dropped off documents earlier. He stepped out cautiously, greeted Ethan with a reserved nod, and asked if now was a suitable time to discuss any concerns. Though Ethan would have preferred to gather his thoughts more thoroughly, he signaled for the man to come inside, if only to get out of the rain. Together, they sat at the cluttered kitchen table, the overhead light flickering as the power line struggled against the storm. In measured, even tones, the associate clarified some of the more complex clauses in the proposal. He laid out the financial commitments. Beck's firm would cover immediate upgrades and repairs, including a state-of-the-art drainage system for the orchard. The farm would repay a portion of these costs through future earnings, once the new system boosted production. There was an option, though not a requirement, for Redwood Farm to provide tours, host workshops, and demonstrate the technology to other farmers. Profit-sharing mechanisms were included, with terms that could be renegotiated if the partnership turned a certain profit margin. If Redwood Farm struggled to meet specific performance milestones, Beck's firm could implement stricter measures or withdraw its support. Ethan absorbed these details with mixed emotions, seeing both rescue and risk reflected in every point. Even so, the immediate promise of a drainage system to save the orchard felt almost too enticing to reject outright. The storm had made it painfully obvious that Redwood Farm, in its current condition, was ill-equipped to survive much longer without an infusion of capital. Ethan kept hearing Lily's words echo in his mind: pride could be as destructive as any storm. Perhaps the time had come for him to bend, just enough to keep Redwood Farm alive for another generation. He pondered whether he could preserve its essence, the intangible heritage passed down through countless family stories, while allowing in this wave of modern technology. By the time the associate departed, the rain had lessened to a drizzle. Ethan followed him out, glancing at the orchard's battered perimeter fence. He admitted to himself that, left on his own, he could not afford the repairs needed to protect it before the next storm came. The land had given all it could, and now it required a kind of stewardship that might extend beyond one man's solitary struggle. Once more, Ethan thought about Oliver Beck, remembering the boy's frightened face as he emerged from the forest. That was the moment everything changed, though he had not known it at the time. With a sigh, he found Lily in the farmhouse. They exchanged a few words without direct quotations, acknowledging that a decision weighed heavily in the air. Lily offered her cautious encouragement, sensing that the farm's survival might hinge on a reluctant partnership. She reminded him that their grandparents had adapted to many changes over the decades: mechanized plowing, chemical fertilizers, and new crop varieties. Perhaps this was simply the next evolution. Though Ethan had not yet signed anything, he felt the inevitability pulling him, like a current too strong to resist. The next morning brought another lull in the weather. A glimmer of sunshine broke through the clouds, warming the saturated fields. Ethan decided to check on a far corner of Redwood Farm, where a small creek bordered the property. The creek often threatened to overflow during heavy rains, which was why Ethan's father had once built a rudimentary dike with sandbags. Those sandbags had eroded over time, and the last storm had carried away most of what remained. Now the creek ran with a swift current, dangerously close to spilling into the lower fields, which were crucial for planting a second round of vegetables. He recognized that constructing a more durable solution would require specialized machinery and a budget he simply did not have. On his way back from the creek, he spotted Lily's car approaching. She had brought him additional information she had dug up on Beck's firm, this time focusing on philanthropic efforts the company had quietly funded: grants for community gardens, scholarships for future agronomists, and mentorship programs for underprivileged youth. It was a side of the corporation that rarely made headlines, overshadowed by more profitable ventures. Lily hoped it would reassure Ethan that he might not be dealing with an entirely soulless entity. Ethan acknowledged the significance of that, though he remained wary that good deeds in one sector did not always reflect broader intentions. As the sun climbed higher, Ethan resolved to walk the length of the property once more, gathering his final impressions before making a decision. He started at the old barn, where sunlight cut through gaps in the roof, illuminating motes of dust. He thought of childhood days spent climbing the rafters and playing hide-and-seek with Lily among stacked hay bales. Next, he passed the tractor shed, where the faithful old machine now stood rusting, needing expensive repairs he had put off for months. He moved toward the fields, still muddy but bathed in light, recalling how they looked in their prime, teeming with healthy plants. Finally, he reached the orchard, where the battered remains of trees stood as a testament to both the power of nature and the farm's struggles. Along the way, he remembered the quiet sense of pride he had felt many times before, proud that Redwood Farm was not just an asset or a piece of land but a place tied to his identity. He wondered whether signing the partnership would preserve that identity or dilute it. The fear that Redwood Farm might become a glossy corporate showcase clashed with the recognition that, without drastic measures, the orchard and fields would soon be gone for good. He realized that refusing help might mean the land would eventually wind up sold at auction, possibly to developers who would raise the orchard to build homes or vacation cabins. Back inside the house, the late afternoon light filtered through weathered curtains, casting long shadows across the kitchen table. The partnership document still lay there, now dog-eared and annotated with pencil marks. The margins were filled with Ethan's notes, including questions about revenue splits, terms of default, and potential expansions. Lily had added a few references of her own, highlighting passages about environmental impact studies and community outreach obligations. They had never worked together on anything quite so formal, and despite the daunting details, Ethan felt a touch of gratitude that he did not have to face this alone. He mulled it over for another day, checking the orchard twice more, almost as if seeking a sign. On the second morning after the storm, just as the skies began to clear, 2 more vehicles arrived. This time, it was Leonard Beck himself, joined by a pair of individuals, one who appeared to be a legal advisor, the other likely an agronomist. They found Ethan in the orchard, where he was attempting to upright a small tree battered by the wind. He felt a pang of embarrassment at the orchard's disheveled appearance, but Leonard made no remarks on the scene, merely observing with a subdued stare. The group retreated to the farmhouse, where Lily, upon seeing them from the window, busied herself making a pot of coffee. The visitors removed their coats and placed documents on the table, carefully avoiding the mud tracked in on the floor. Leonard took a seat, steepled his fingers, and addressed Ethan with measured calm. He expressed once again how grateful he was that Oliver had been found safe. Then he pivoted to the matter at hand, confirming that his associates had relayed the basics of the partnership. He outlined the improvements the company was ready to deploy immediately, from orchard restoration to creek fortification. He spoke of using Redwood Farm as a cornerstone in a broader initiative aimed at supporting sustainable small-scale agriculture. Ethan listened, checking for any hidden arrogance or undue pressure. To his surprise, Leonard's tone remained respectful, emphasizing that the partnership would only succeed if Ethan maintained a genuine commitment to the land and its traditions. The legal advisor clarified certain contractual obligations, noting that Redwood Farm's identity and heritage were valuable components of the project's appeal. The agronomist explained how modern systems could integrate with traditional methods, preserving biodiversity while increasing yields. Each point added a layer of practicality to the vision. As the conversation drew on, Lily gently placed a steaming mug on the table for Ethan. He gripped it as if seeking warmth or courage in the swirl of rising steam. He understood that signing would mean Redwood Farm might never be the same again. However, he also sensed an undercurrent of mutual respect from Leonard. There was an acknowledgement that Redwood Farm was special, that Ethan's willingness to risk everything, whether to save a lost child or to protect a family legacy, might be precisely what the project needed in order to succeed. By late afternoon, the documents lay on the table in front of Ethan, open to the signature page. Lily stood silently nearby, her expression cautious but supportive. Leonard remained seated, his posture reflecting patience rather than impatience, as though he recognized the weight of the decision. Outside, the storm clouds had drifted away, revealing a clear sky that promised a calm night for once. The orchard, battered but still standing, seemed to wait for an answer along with everyone else in the room. Ethan let out a slow breath, recalling what had led them to this crossroads: a pair of footprints in the forest, a frightened child with a scraped leg, and a sleepless night spent in worry for a life that was not even his own. In that act of compassion, he had unknowingly cast Redwood Farm's future into the path of a powerful stranger. Now that stranger offered a hand to guide the farm away from financial ruin. The irony was not lost on him. He thought again about how his grandfather had adapted to new planting methods when forced by circumstance, how his father had changed crop rotations during a near-famine year. Each generation had faced its own test, and perhaps this was his. He weighed the pen in his fingers, feeling the gravity of a lifetime's worth of memories converge in that moment. Redwood Farm, in all its worn fences, neglected equipment, and battered orchards, seemed to breathe around him, waiting for his choice. After a contemplative silence, he placed the tip of the pen to the paper, signing his name slowly, as though each letter carried the resonance of past generations. A hush settled across the room as he set the pen down, a hush that felt both like an end and a beginning. Leonard thanked him with a polite nod, then gestured to his legal advisor to finalize the paperwork. The agronomist noted that a team would arrive within days to start implementing the orchard restoration plan. Lily watched from the corner, a mix of relief and trepidation in her eyes. Ethan felt a whirlwind of emotions: grief for the era that was passing, hope for what might take root next, and a lingering self-doubt about whether he had made the right call. But the reality was there: Redwood Farm could not continue down its old path without risking total collapse. Before departing, Leonard mentioned that Oliver was recovering well and often asked about the man who had found him. He added that, once the orchard was stable, he hoped Oliver might visit Redwood Farm to see the positive changes being made. Ethan listened without comment, though the image of the boy's grateful face flickered across his mind like a reminder that sometimes, in saving someone else, one might also begin to save oneself. The SUVs backed away, leaving behind a sense of finality in their wake, as though the farm itself had been marked for transformation. In the fading light, Ethan and Lily stood outside, near the gate. The contract sat on the kitchen table behind them, an official testament to a future path that neither could fully envision. Lily rested a hand lightly on Ethan's shoulder, signaling her support. He gazed out at the orchard, where the last rays of sunlight ignited the wet leaves in a muted glow, as though the land was inhaling with renewed vigor. For the first time in many months, Ethan allowed himself a faint semblance of optimism. He understood that the real work was just beginning, that Redwood Farm's transformation into a technological model would not be simple or painless. But it would be survival, and perhaps even a new chapter of possibilities. A few nights passed in uneasy anticipation. The weather held steady, granting the ground time to dry. Ethan focused on minor tasks, clearing debris from the fields and double-checking irrigation lines. He found himself frequently pausing to consider the orchard, mentally noting where new drainage channels might be placed. One morning, Lily arrived with fresh groceries and a rare grin, explaining that she had good news from the bank. The rumor of a partnership with Beck's firm had evidently reassured them that Redwood Farm might soon be financially viable again. Rhonda Caldwell at the bank informed Lily that they were willing to consider a restructured repayment plan if official confirmation of the partnership was provided. Though Ethan harbored a lingering distrust of corporate synergy, he felt a surge of relief that the immediate threat of foreclosure might recede. That same afternoon, a convoy of trucks pulled in, each packed with tools, equipment, and rolls of specialized materials. The workforce that arrived wore branded jackets: engineers, laborers, and technicians from Beck's organization. They set about erecting temporary shelters for storage and testing sites, proceeding with methodical coordination. Ethan, feeling somewhat out of place on his own farm, approached them with a guarded nod. Their foreperson greeted him respectfully, acknowledging that they were there under the newly signed agreement. Without explicit words, the foreperson signaled that they recognized the importance of Redwood Farm's heritage and promised to keep disruption to a minimum. It began with clearing debris near the orchard's perimeter and installing a robust drainage system designed to funnel excess water away from the tree roots. Deep trenches were dug, lined with gravel and advanced piping, the likes of which Ethan had never seen. Occasionally, a technician would consult him on the farm's contours, where flooding was worst, how the orchard slope influenced water flow. It felt strange to watch unfamiliar hands unearthing parts of Redwood Farm, as though revealing layers of buried secrets. Yet there was also hope in the realization that these efforts might keep the orchard safe through the next storm. Each evening, the workers left, the fields littered with newly dug channels, and Ethan wandered around, trying to digest the rapid changes. Within a week, the orchard stood on the verge of a renaissance. New saplings arrived in carefully sealed containers, each accompanied by detailed instructions for grafting onto existing rootstock. The agronomist explained that this approach would blend the orchard's historic varieties with more resilient strains, aiming for higher yields and better resistance to disease. Though part of Ethan balked at altering the orchard his grandparents had cultivated, another part acknowledged that such innovations might ensure these trees stood for generations to come. Lily marveled at the transformation, though she kept her excitement tempered. She reminded Ethan that corporate interests could shift at any moment, and that if profitability declined, the partnership might sour. Ethan, in turn, pointed out that Redwood Farm now had a fighting chance, something it lacked mere weeks ago. They both chose to meet each day's progress with cautious optimism, refusing to let the fear of the unknown overshadow the tangible improvements taking shape all around them. One afternoon, as the sun beat down on the orchard's newly installed drip irrigation lines, Ethan stepped away from the hustle to stand at the edge of the creek. The water ran lower now, partly diverted by fresh reinforcements that the workers had engineered along the bank. Sandbags were replaced by more permanent barriers that would reduce flood risk significantly. He looked back at the farm's profile, noticing the reflection of freshly dug trenches, new piping, and the hum of machines that tested sensor arrays. In the distant field, a small group of workers installed panels that would power a portion of the farm's grid using renewable energy. It was nothing short of astonishing to see Redwood Farm integrated with advanced technology in so brief a time. Standing there, he thought again of Oliver Beck, the child whose lost footprints had led to all of this. If not for that day in the woods, Redwood Farm might still be an isolated place on the brink of collapse, with Ethan fighting a lonely battle against debt and the elements. The idea that a single act of compassion could unfold into such sweeping consequences was both humbling and profound. He wondered if the orchard's rejuvenation might outlive him, passing on as a testament to adaptation and resilience. As twilight fell, Ethan joined Lily on the porch. A sense of commotion lingered around the yard as the last of the workers finished their tasks. When they finally departed, the night air settled, filled with the rustle of leaves and distant crickets. The orchard, partially illuminated by new lighting fixtures, displayed the silhouette of carefully braced trees. The farm's future felt both precarious and filled with potential, teetering on a balance of tradition and modern innovation. Lily mentioned that she had overheard some of the workers talking about finalizing the orchard's irrigation by week's end. The pace of change was astounding, leaving them both breathless with a mixture of hope and doubt. They parted ways for the night, Lily driving back to her home, while Ethan remained to stare up at the stars. Though physically exhausted, he found it difficult to rest, his mind churning with the realization that Redwood Farm was entering a critical phase. The newly signed partnership had opened doors he never knew existed, but it also exposed him to new vulnerabilities. He did not just answer to himself or to the memory of his ancestors anymore, he had to answer to a network of people who expected results and accountability. Pausing at the orchard's edge, he placed his hand on the sturdy trunk of an older apple tree, feeling the bark's familiar texture. He wondered if the tree could sense these changes, if it could appreciate the lengths to which he was going to protect it. The next morning brought fresh activity and the promise of more visitors. A communications team from Beck's organization was slated to visit the farm, tasked with capturing footage and interviews for promotional material. Ethan found that idea intimidating, but the agreement included a provision for limited publicity. The orchard was to be marketed as a living example of modern solutions blending with time-honored agriculture. Lily arrived early, helping Ethan tidy the front porch and pointing out that a clean, welcoming entrance would help Redwood Farm present itself in the best light. When the team arrived, they wasted no time setting up cameras and discussing angles for filming. They asked Ethan about the orchard's history, encouraging him to describe the significance of specific trees and the farm's connection to Redwood Valley. Though he felt uneasy speaking in front of a camera, he managed to convey a sense of the farm's legacy while emphasizing the struggle it had faced against weather extremes and financial hurdles. He avoided direct references to the rescue that had sparked this partnership, partly because it felt too personal to share broadly, and partly because he did not want the story reduced to a convenient media narrative. Meanwhile, in the background, specialists continued their work, testing soil composition with portable kits. Electricians refined the power setup near the barn, and a water management crew finalized the layout of new channels around the orchard. By late afternoon, the filming was done, leaving Ethan mentally drained. He retreated to a quiet corner of the property, near a battered wooden bench under an old oak tree, a place he had often gone to gather his thoughts. Overhead, clouds drifted by in slow procession, offering no sign of the next storm. For the first time in years, he felt a cautious sense of stability, however temporary it might prove. The next day brought a chance encounter that further confirmed how far Redwood Farm's reputation had spread. Two local farmers, acquaintances from the county market, dropped by unannounced. They had heard rumors of an advanced technology partnership transforming Ethan's fields. Curious and perhaps skeptical, they wanted to see it for themselves. Ethan offered them a tour, walking them through newly installed irrigation lines and the orchard's reorganized layout. Their faces shifted from mild disbelief to uneasy curiosity, eventually landing on a grudging admiration for the scope of what was happening. By the time they left, Ethan realized Redwood Farm might become a catalyst in the community, whether he wanted that role or not. People would look to it for proof that technology could sustain small-scale agriculture in an ever-changing climate. To his own surprise, a spark of pride flickered in his chest at the idea of Redwood Farm serving a greater purpose. He had once been fiercely protective of its solitude, but necessity had forced open the gates. Now the land stood as both a beneficiary and an example. Weeks began to blur together as more components of the partnership fell into place. Technicians installed weather stations that streamed real-time data to a central system. Agricultural specialists proposed new crop rotations designed to maximize soil fertility. Engineers collaborated with local experts to reinforce creek embankments, ensuring another flood would not sweep away months of work. The orchard's revival progressed steadily, with new grafts showing signs of adapting well. Each day brought a minor triumph or a small setback, but always with a sense of forward momentum. Amid this bustle, Ethan found himself missing the quiet rhythms that had once defined Redwood Farm. The hum of machinery sometimes drowned out the sound of wind in the pines. The orchard, while more robust, no longer felt like a secret grove known only to him and his ancestors. He reminded himself that change was inevitable, a necessary evolution if Redwood Farm was to endure for future generations. Still, he occasionally strolled out after dusk, once the workers had gone and the machinery lay silent, taking in the tranquil hush that had been part of his life for so long. The moonlight revealed the orchard's new lines and trenches, a testament to the price of survival. Lily remained a steady presence through all of this, helping with administrative tasks, advocating for Ethan whenever corporate paperwork threatened to become overwhelming. She noticed the fatigue in her brother's eyes but also recognized that for the first time in years, he was building a future rather than scrambling to stave off ruin. She sometimes teased him gently, suggesting that Redwood Farm might become a tourist stop, complete with guided tours and a small cafe. Ethan offered a hesitant half-smile at such jokes, unsure whether to laugh or brace himself for another wave of unexpected changes. Eventually, word reached Leonard Beck that Redwood Farm was making excellent progress in the orchard revitalization. He arranged a visit to see the results firsthand, this time planning to bring Oliver, hoping the boy might form a positive memory of the place where he had been found. When Ethan heard the news, he felt a mixture of apprehension and resolve. He had rescued Oliver without any notion of gain or future connection, but life had knitted their stories together in unpredictable ways. Perhaps seeing Oliver healthy and safe would be a reminder that some good could come from all this upheaval. On the morning of their arrival, Ethan took a final walk through the orchard, checking each row. The grafted branches were sealed and secure. The drainage trenches still showed signs of recent rain, but no major puddles formed around the roots. A mild breeze carried the scent of newly turned earth, mingling with the orchard's faint fragrance of apples. He wondered how Oliver would react to the orchard, now drastically changed from the wild, storm-ravaged version that loomed on the horizon the night Ethan had found him. He also wondered how he himself would feel, standing alongside the boy and the man whose influence had paved the way for Redwood Farm's rebirth. When he returned to the farmhouse, Lily was tidying the porch and had set out a few simple refreshments. She seemed mildly nervous at the idea of hosting such a visit, but Ethan reassured her that however official things looked, Redwood Farm was still their home. The sound of approaching engines signaled the arrival of Leonard Beck's vehicles, though this time the group was smaller, just one SUV and another car for the associates. Oliver stepped out carefully, initially hiding behind an adult figure until he spotted Ethan's familiar form. The boy waved shyly, his eyes wide with curiosity at the transformed landscape. Leonard emerged next, exchanging polite greetings before turning his attention to the orchard. He listened intently as one of the agronomists on site described the state-of-the-art irrigation systems and the progress of the grafts. Oliver, meanwhile, wandered closer to Ethan, tentatively peering at the trees. A faint smile crossed the boy's face, a mix of awe and something else Ethan could not quite name. Perhaps the orchard now seemed less forbidding, more like a place of potential. Oliver pointed to the trunks, noticing the neat bandages where new grafts merged with old bark. Ethan knelt to offer a quiet explanation, again without direct quotations, that these new branches would ensure the orchard's survival for decades to come. Standing nearby, Leonard observed the interaction. His expression softened slightly, as though reminded that all these technological advancements served a human story. Ethan could sense that the orchard impressed Leonard, but more so, the simple fact that Redwood Farm still felt like a living entity, not just a sterile laboratory for corporate experiments. The group continued through the rows, discussing water flow, pest management, and future expansions. Oliver walked slightly ahead, occasionally stopping to look at something that caught his eye, the bright midday sun illuminating the orchard's changed contours. Ethan trailed behind, watching him, recalling how different Oliver had looked the day he found him, trembling and covered in grime. Eventually, they circled back toward the farmhouse, where Lily offered a modest spread of homemade biscuits and fresh cider from what remained of the orchard's old stock. Oliver sipped cautiously, then brightened at the taste. The tension that often marked Ethan's interactions with Leonard softened in that moment, replaced by a mutual acknowledgement that Redwood Farm had become something more than either of them anticipated. In the quiet hum of conversation, Ethan realized that while the orchard had physically changed, its spirit endured, shaped by the people who found refuge and purpose in its shade. The day drew to a close under a mild sky, and Leonard and his associates prepared to head back to the city. Oliver lingered a bit, his eyes wandering to a spot near the forest's edge. It seemed he remembered the day he had emerged from the woods, scared and unsure. Ethan watched as Leonard gently steered the boy back toward the waiting vehicle. It was a subtle reminder that Redwood Farm and the Beck family were bound by a twist of fate neither had seen coming. Although Ethan felt no desire to dwell on the dramatic rescue, he understood that it would forever be a turning point in the farm's history. After the vehicles disappeared over the dirt road, Lily and Ethan stood together, letting the orchard's renewed silence envelop them. That night, a calm settled over Redwood Farm unlike anything Ethan had experienced in a long time. The orchard, illuminated by newly installed lamps, appeared almost ethereal, each tree casting a soft, elongated shadow on the ground. He gazed from his porch, thinking about how, in saving a lost child, he had unwittingly forged a path to save the land he cherished. The partnership might still hold unknown challenges, but for the moment, Redwood Farm was alive with possibility. He felt as though every root, every leaf, and every newly grafted branch pulsed with a revitalized heartbeat, echoing across generations. His mind turned to the future, imagining what the farm might look like in a year, or 5, or even 20. He pictured young saplings reaching maturity, tended by advanced irrigation systems yet still thriving in the centuries-old soil that bore the imprint of his forebears. He wondered if Oliver would return one day, perhaps older and more curious, eager to see how technology and tradition could coexist. He thought of Lily's unwavering support, the bank's tentative reconsideration, and the cautious acceptance of change that had brought Redwood Farm back from the brink. The orchard stood as proof that renewal was possible when resilience met opportunity. Even the land, in its quiet way, seemed to whisper that while transformation often brought uncertainty, it could also breathe new life into old roots. Ethan awoke the following morning with an uncharacteristic lightness in his chest, as though the orchard's revival had signaled a fresh start not just for Redwood Farm, but for his own outlook. The previous weeks had upended long-held habits and introduced new pressures, yet he felt an undercurrent of relief each time he walked the property. The orchard was no longer on the brink of extinction. It was, instead, a place of active renewal, each grafted branch humming with the possibility of bountiful harvests to come. Even the looming presence of corporate partners seemed tolerable compared to the immediate threat of losing everything. He began the day by wandering through the dew-soaked grass near the orchard's edge, inspecting the newly installed drainage channels. The water flowed in narrow streams beneath protective grates, directed away from delicate roots and funneled into a reservoir system that would be used during drier months. He knelt beside one opening, hearing the steady trickle that confirmed the channels were working properly. It was one of many small miracles that had taken place under the guidance of Leonard Beck's team, solutions Ethan had once thought far beyond his grasp. He rose slowly, taking in the orchard's morning hush. The light caught beads of moisture on the leaves, giving them a jeweled glow, and a handful of songbirds fluttered between the branches. For an instant, the technology that had so drastically changed this orchard felt almost invisible, seamlessly blended into the landscape. He thought about how his grandfather would have reacted, weighing reverence for tradition against the undeniable fact that Redwood Farm had, at last, some breathing room. Perhaps that was the essence of progress, finding a path forward that did not entirely erase what came before. Soon, the rumble of arriving vehicles carried across the field. Technicians, agronomists, and a couple of newly hired local workers emerged, ready to continue the day's efforts. They greeted Ethan with polite nods, some offering quick updates on soil sensor calibrations or irrigation timing. He listened carefully, still finding the technical jargon somewhat alien, but he was learning piece by piece. One of the local hires, a woman named Teresa who had grown up just a few miles away, approached to discuss orchard pests. She pointed out subtle signs that a certain type of beetle might be trying to infest weaker branches. They talked about how combining ecological measures, like predator insects or specialized netting, with high-tech detection systems might offer a balanced approach. Ethan appreciated her insight, glad that the new workforce included people rooted in the region's rhythms. The hours slipped by in a whirl of activity. Crews tested remote-controlled drones designed to survey field conditions, an innovation Ethan would have once dismissed as pure fantasy. Over by the barn, a newly delivered piece of equipment, a precision seeder, waited in protective wrapping, set to be assembled and demonstrated in the coming days. The goal was to expand Redwood Farm's offerings beyond the orchard, diversifying with small-scale grains and specialty vegetables. If the orchard thrived, perhaps the rest of the farmland could share in that success. Shortly after midday, Lily appeared, wearing a determined expression and carrying a stack of folders. She had taken it upon herself to manage much of the partnership's administrative burden, translating the technical and legal documentation into terms they both could understand. Ethan welcomed her inside, where the farmhouse kitchen table had been cleared of the usual clutter to accommodate a laptop, scattered papers, and a large monthly planner. They stood side by side, reviewing the latest documents outlining the next phase of improvements, an expanded greenhouse unit near the southern field, a pilot project for solar panels, and possibly a new outbuilding to house advanced monitoring equipment. While they worked, the afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, catching flecks of dust in the air. Ethan noticed Lily fidgeting with a pen, tapping it lightly against the edge of a page. He asked, in his indirect way, if something was weighing on her mind. She admitted she was worried about the speed of these changes. It was one thing to save the orchard, it was another to welcome an entire wave of modern infrastructure that could alter Redwood Farm's character beyond recognition. Ethan found himself echoing her concerns. Though he had no desire to revert to crisis mode, he also struggled with how rapidly Redwood Farm was turning into a demonstration site for cutting-edge agriculture. Nevertheless, they both recognized the positives. Local businesses were starting to notice Redwood Farm's revival, and a few vendors had inquired about future produce contracts. Word had even spread to a nearby county, prompting an artisan cider maker to leave a message for Ethan, expressing interest in Redwood Farm's apple crop once it matured under these improved conditions. It struck Ethan as surreal. A few months ago, he had felt cornered on all sides, burdened by looming debt and battered fields. Now new possibilities seemed to sprout from every direction. Late in the afternoon, Lily departed to prepare lesson materials for her students, and Ethan headed back outside. The orchard's transformation still called to him, so he strolled between the rows, pausing at each tree to check for signs of stress or damage. He remembered how, not long ago, many of these trunks were leaning precariously, the ground around them eroded by relentless storms. Now the carefully placed supports and well-designed drainage had stabilized them. Fresh graft sprouted new leaves, hinting at a future harvest that might surpass anything Redwood Farm had ever produced. Yet, as the sun dipped low, Ethan felt a tug of nostalgia for the simpler days when he knew every inch of this property by heart. The orchard had been a place of quiet reflection, an unassuming corner of the world that embodied his family's perseverance. Now it was a symbol of transformation, its branches and roots laced with sensors and tubes. He lingered under the canopy of a particularly old tree, pressing his palm against its bark. It felt solid, as always, though changed, a microcosm of everything happening around him. A distant whistle broke his reverie. One of the workers stood near the creek, waving to get Ethan's attention. He jogged over to find that they had discovered a minor breach in one of the newly reinforced embankments. The water flow was low at the moment, but if heavy rains returned, the breach could expand. Ethan helped them secure more stones and supportive mesh, working until twilight. While placing a large rock, he felt a sharp pang in his shoulder, a reminder of the wear and tear accumulated over countless years of manual labor. He gritted his teeth, determined to see the day's work through, but accepted that he might need to rely more on the skilled teams around him. Night fell quietly, with only a few lights glowing in the orchard where technicians performed final checks on the irrigation timers. Standing near the barn, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The day had been long, but productive. As he took a last look around, he noticed how the orchard's LED floodlights created a faint halo around the rows of trees. It was beautiful in an otherworldly way, and also a bit unsettling, a sign that Redwood Farm was now part farm and part research station. He tried to focus on the positives. The orchard was healthier than it had been in years, and for the first time, he wasn't dreading a letter from the bank or a calamity he couldn't fix. He returned to the farmhouse, ate a modest supper, and fell into a deep sleep, lulled by a sense of guarded optimism. The next morning dawned bright and cloudless, the perfect weather for the demonstration of the new precision seeder. A representative from Beck's firm arrived with a small entourage, ready to show Ethan how to operate the machine. They drove it out to a plot near the orchard, where the ground had been tilled in preparation for trial rows of wheat and barley. As the demonstration began, curious local farmers gathered by the fence, drawn by rumors of advanced technology at Redwood Farm. Ethan tried to follow the instructions as best he could. The seeder, bristling with sensors, took real-time soil readings to calculate the optimal depth for each seed. The representative beamed as he explained that this method minimized waste and maximized yield. For a moment, Ethan felt as though he was learning to fly some futuristic vehicle rather than do a basic farm chore. He noticed a few of the local farmers whispering among themselves, their expressions ranging from fascination to mild cynicism. Over time, though, their skepticism seemed to soften as the machine worked smoothly, leaving behind evenly spaced rows that promised higher germination rates. When the demonstration ended, a small group of onlookers came forward to ask questions. A tall man in a worn baseball cap introduced himself as Gregory, a neighbor who ran a modest vegetable operation a couple of miles away. He admitted he was curious but skeptical, given the high cost of advanced equipment. Ethan, still feeling somewhat overwhelmed, explained that Redwood Farms' transformation was a unique partnership, one he never would have been able to fund on his own. Gregory sighed, acknowledging that times were changing, even if many local farmers found it hard to keep up. Another onlooker, a woman named Felicia who raised heritage livestock, shook her head, remarking that while the technology was impressive, it seemed to be taking the soul out of farming. Ethan understood her sentiment but refrained from arguing, not entirely sure himself how to merge tradition with innovation without losing the essence of Redwood Farm. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Ethan caught sight of a county official he recognized, Caroline Howe, who managed the local agricultural extension office. She approached to congratulate him on the orchard's progress, adding that Redwood Farm might soon be eligible for certain grants that favored sustainable practices. It was the first time Ethan had heard the word sustainable linked to Redwood Farm without an air of pity or doubt. Caroline noted that these grants could further bolster Redwood Farm's finances, but she also cautioned that partnering with a large corporation came with its own set of regulatory hurdles. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of another layer of paperwork looming. By midday, the demonstration had wrapped up, and Lily arrived to see the results. She was pleased to note that the new rows were already drawing attention from vendors interested in locally sourced grains. The orchard, for its part, continued to thrive. Workers carefully monitored newly grafted branches, trimming away any damaged leaves, and treating sections of bark that showed slight cracks from the strain of change. The orchard was not just surviving, it was adapting with remarkable speed. In the coming weeks, Redwood Farm's visibility grew. A regional news outlet paid a visit, capturing footage of Ethan guiding cameras through the orchard's progress. Lily stood in the background, discreetly making sure the reporters didn't wander into off-limits areas. The segment aired locally, painting Redwood Farm as a pioneering fusion of old and new. Friends and acquaintances reached out, offering congratulatory words, but also asking pointed questions about autonomy under Beck's corporate umbrella. Ethan struggled to articulate answers that would satisfy them, or himself. He knew the arrangement was complex, Redwood Farm was no longer solely his domain. Yet a part of him believed that forging ahead was better than watching everything slip away. One crisp morning, a thin layer of fog clung to the low-lying fields as Ethan made his usual rounds. When he reached the orchard, he spotted Teresa and another local hire discussing potential fungus issues that might emerge if the fog lingered. Before he could join them, he noticed a figure standing near the edge of the orchard, gazing at the rows of trees in apparent wonder. Drawing closer, he recognized Oliver Beck. The boy had arrived quietly, accompanied by one of Leonard's assistants, and stood with his hands in his pockets. He seemed older than Ethan remembered, though it had only been a few months. A faint smile tugged at the boy's features, as if he was both shy and fascinated. Ethan approached slowly, remembering the day he had found Oliver shivering at the base of an oak in Redwood Forest. Now, the boy appeared healthy, standing confidently on farmland that had undergone a transformation as dramatic as his own rescue. Oliver's eyes roamed across the orchard, lingering on the careful bracing and irrigation lines. He looked at Ethan with a silent acknowledgement of how much had changed. Without employing direct quotations, Ethan bent down to convey a brief reassurance, suggesting that Oliver was welcome to wander the orchard if he wished, as long as he stayed close and minded any equipment. For the next hour, Oliver trailed Ethan like a quiet observer, occasionally crouching to inspect a patch of soil or peering up at the newly grafted branches. Teresa offered him a small measuring device used to test moisture levels in the soil, and Oliver tried it out, appearing intrigued by the mix of nature and technology. Though the child said little, his wide-eyed curiosity hinted that he was internalizing the farm's complexity. At one point, Ethan realized this orchard might be as mysterious and wondrous to Oliver as the forest had once been. By mid-afternoon, Leonard arrived to collect his son. He found Oliver kneeling near a young apple sapling, carefully running his fingers along the mesh that protected it from pests. Leonard watched for a moment before calling his name. As Oliver stood, Ethan sensed a subtle shift in the boy's manner, as if stepping back under the formal sphere of his father's presence. Leonard thanked Ethan indirectly for letting Oliver observe the orchard, noting how meaningful it was for the boy to see the place that had inspired such a profound shift in their lives. Ethan offered a simple nod, unsure if he could express how much the orchard's renewal had meant to him as well. After they left, Ethan felt a wave of introspection. The orchard, once a quiet refuge of personal memories, was steadily becoming a communal space, visited by media crews, local farmers, corporate experts, and even the child who had set everything in motion. He wondered if a piece of Redwood Farm's spirit might be lost in this constant exposure, replaced by carefully curated presentations of technology-driven success. At the same time, he recognized that Redwood Farm now had a far better chance of enduring for future generations. The orchard remained at the heart of that evolution, its newly grafted branches symbolizing growth that neither time nor storms could easily uproot. Work continued. Fields were measured and replanted with experimental crops, greenhouses were constructed, and the orchard's canopy thickened each day, testifying to robust new life. Lily worked closely with an environmental consultant to ensure compliance with regulations, while Ethan oversaw a small but motivated team of local workers who balanced new methodologies with traditional knowledge. Together, they made progress that would have seemed impossible a few short months prior. The financial strain began to ease, too, as Redwood Farm attracted modest investment and early commitments from buyers who wanted produce farmed under these modern yet responsible conditions. Still, not everything flowed without friction. One evening, Ethan received a phone call from Caroline Howe at the Agricultural Extension Office. She warned him, cautiously, yet earnestly, that some local farmers resented the corporate influence at Redwood Farm. Rumors were swirling that Beck's firm might use Redwood Farm as a Trojan horse to dominate local markets, undercutting smaller farms until they had little choice but to adopt similar partnerships. Caroline advised Ethan to host an open house or some kind of public meeting to address concerns. He found the idea daunting. But he agreed it was necessary to maintain goodwill among the people who had once been his friends and neighbors. Over the next week, Lily and Ethan organized a modest gathering. They planned to showcase the orchard's improvements, the new greenhouse, and the advanced equipment that had been introduced. They hoped to reassure local farmers that Redwood Farm was not the vanguard of a corporate takeover, but rather a test site that could benefit the entire region if handled correctly. On the morning of the open house, Ethan woke with a tight feeling in his chest. He had grown accustomed to cameras and official visits, but welcoming neighbors, some skeptical, some openly hostile, felt far more personal. A few hours later, trucks and cars began arriving, parking haphazardly in the once quiet yard. People formed small clusters, exchanging hushed remarks as they took in the orchard's renewed appearance. Ethan saw some familiar faces: Gregory from the vegetable farm, Felicia from the heritage livestock operation, and others he had known through years of county fairs and farmers' markets. There were also fresh faces, newcomers who had heard Redwood Farm was forging a path with advanced irrigation and sensor systems. Some local reporters showed up, hoping to capture the community's reaction to corporate-backed innovation in their backyard. Ethan and Lily led the group on a walk through the orchard, pointing out the grafts and explaining how the drainage system had averted flood damage after a recent rainfall. They showed visitors the greenhouse foundation, where sturdy frames and temperature control systems were nearly complete. Some participants asked polite questions, wanting to know the costs, the yield improvements, and the trade-offs. Others eyed the orchard's technology warily, expressing concern about corporate reach and whether small farmers would be able to remain competitive. Ethan did his best to answer, invoking Redwood Farm's near collapse and how this partnership had been the only feasible route to preserve a generations-old legacy. He avoided mentioning Oliver or the exact impetus of the arrangement, feeling that was too personal a detail to broadcast. A subtle tension underlay the entire tour. Ethan sensed that while most visitors were genuinely curious, a vocal minority suspected Redwood Farm of betraying local values for corporate gain. Near the orchard's midpoint, a heated debate flared when someone accused Beck's company of planning to patent new crop varieties that would force farmers to buy expensive seeds each season. Lily tried to interject, explaining that Redwood Farm's agreement did not permit the commercialization of such patents, but the man remained unconvinced. Another attendee, a younger farmer, came to Redwood Farm's defense, arguing that modernization was a necessary evolution in a changing climate. The exchange ended abruptly when someone noticed Ethan's troubled expression, a reminder that Redwood Farm was more than a battleground for ideological disputes. Eventually, the tour wound back toward the farmhouse, where Lily had set out refreshments. The crowd dispersed into smaller groups, continuing to talk among themselves in hushed tones. Ethan felt drained, noticing how easily a single spark of doubt could ignite strong emotions. As he was collecting empty cups near the orchard fence, Caroline approached with a soft smile. She acknowledged the tension but suggested that no real progress came without pushing boundaries. Redwood Farm's transformation was bound to provoke debate, especially in a community that prized independence and tradition. She encouraged Ethan to remain transparent, to show that Redwood Farm's path did not have to overshadow the individuality of neighboring operations. As the sun began to set, vehicles pulled away, leaving Ethan and Lily alone to clean up. The orchard looked serene in the evening light, its leaves turning golden at the edges where the last rays touched them. Despite the lingering sense of discord, Ethan felt a measure of relief that at least the conversation had begun. Better to face these challenges openly than to let mistrust fester unseen. In truth, Redwood Farm would never again be the quiet place it once was. It was now a focal point, with every success or failure magnified under the scrutiny of neighbors, the media, and the corporate entity funding its transformation. In the days following the open house, work continued at a brisk pace. The new greenhouse neared completion, and the orchard's integrated pest management system passed its first test when a minor aphid invasion was contained swiftly with minimal chemical intervention. Every small victory helped quell some of Ethan's lingering doubts, though he often replayed the harsher criticisms voiced at the gathering. He could not change how people perceived corporate influence, but he could strive to ensure that Redwood Farm served as a genuine model for beneficial, responsible progress. One morning, news arrived that a major storm system was barreling toward Redwood Valley, threatening high winds and torrential rain. The orchard was better prepared than ever, with reinforced drainage and sturdy new supports for the trees, yet Ethan felt his anxiety spike. Memories of past storms returned, of lost harvests and desperate attempts to salvage the orchard's fragile limbs. Even though Redwood Farm now boasted advanced systems and more manpower, nature could still wreak havoc in ways no technology could fully predict. He rallied the team to secure loose equipment, double-check the drainage channels, and fasten additional braces to the orchard's more delicate saplings. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned a deep, bruised purple, and the air felt electric. Lily made sure to back up important files and connect essential systems to backup power supplies. Technicians hurried to seal sensor arrays against the threat of water damage. Some of the local workers recalled older methods of stormproofing, draping tarps and tying extra rope around orchard posts. The synergy of tradition and technology seemed almost symbolic of Redwood Farm's entire journey, as though the farm itself stood at the intersection of old knowledge and new resources, bracing for the unknown. The storm struck just after dusk, unleashing a torrent of rain and powerful gusts. Ethan positioned himself near the orchard, ready to confront any breaches or fallen branches. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating trees bending under the wind's force. The newly dug trenches gurgled with runoff, quickly channeling water away from roots that would have otherwise been submerged. Several times, Ethan splashed through ankle-deep puddles, checking for blockages or breaks in the drainage pipes. The orchard lights flickered but held, powered by a partial grid and newly installed backup generators. All night, the wind howled, rattling windows and tearing at loose shingles on the barn roof. Sheets of rain pummeled the land, filling the creek to a dangerous level. Ethan, drenched despite his waterproof jacket, fought exhaustion as he moved from one critical spot to another. Lily, just as determined, kept watch indoors, scanning for system alerts and dispatching local workers where they were needed most. Whenever Ethan paused to catch his breath, he marveled at how, months ago, he would have faced such a storm nearly alone. Now Redwood Farm had a team and the technology to stand a fighting chance. By dawn, the storm's ferocity relented, leaving a thick mist that clung to every surface. The orchard dripped steadily, branches and trunks soaked but largely intact. Water roared through the newly enhanced creek embankments, swirling with debris that might otherwise have spilled into the lower fields. A small group of workers emerged, yawning but ready to assess the damage. They began to find downed limbs, waterlogged patches in the fields, and some minor structural issues with the barn roof, yet nothing approaching the catastrophic losses of previous years. Ethan walked the length of the orchard in the morning's pale light, heart pounding with the aftershocks of adrenaline. He checked each sapling, each trunk, each brace. A few branches had snapped, and some grafted limbs had taken a beating, but the majority of the orchard remained upright and healthy. The drainage channels had functioned better than he could have hoped, preventing the kind of root rot that had once destroyed entire sections of Redwood Farm's apple trees. On the far side of the orchard, a massive old tree had lost a sizable limb, the splintered wood revealing rings that might have numbered close to a century. Ethan felt a twinge of sadness as he ran his hand across the exposed core, thinking of how each ring represented a year of trials and triumphs. He made a mental note to ask Teresa how best to treat the wound and save the rest of the trunk. Lily emerged from the farmhouse, meeting Ethan beneath the battered oak. Their exhaustion was clear, but so was their relief. Redwood Farm had weathered the storm with far less damage than in years past, a testament to the combined efforts of technology, community, and old-fashioned tenacity. Though the cost of these improvements was an ongoing concern, the storm had proven that the orchard and surrounding fields could withstand extremes without catastrophe. News of Redwood Farm's resilience spread quickly. Within days, local press highlighted how the orchard's new systems had successfully mitigated flood and wind damage. Some skeptics softened their stance, acknowledging that perhaps the partnership with Beck's firm had merits. Others remained unconvinced, warning that Redwood Farm would pay a steep price in autonomy down the road. Regardless, Ethan and Lily pressed forward, focusing on immediate tasks, repairing minor damage, clearing debris, and nurturing the orchard's battered limbs back to health. During one of these cleanup sessions, Ethan received a call from Leonard Beck, who expressed quiet satisfaction that the orchard had survived the storm intact. He also mentioned that a delegation of potential partners, possibly investors and agricultural experts, planned to visit Redwood Farm soon, viewing it as a showcase of what small-scale operations could achieve with the right support. Ethan's stomach lurched at the thought of yet another wave of strangers, each with their own agenda. But he recognized that Redwood Farm now occupied a larger stage than ever before. Whether he liked it or not, Redwood Farm was evolving beyond the narrow boundaries of family inheritance. It was becoming an emblem of modern resilience, forged by necessity and guided by technologies that still felt novel to him. The day the delegation arrived, the orchard stood in full summer splendor, leaves thick and green, grafted branches bearing early signs of fruit. Several vehicles pulled in, some bearing out-of-state license plates, and a small crowd emerged, men and women in business attire, a few academics, and at least one person carrying professional camera equipment. They gathered in front of the farmhouse, exchanging pleasantries as Lily handed out simple brochures explaining Redwood Farm's history and the improvements made over the past months. Ethan guided the group to the orchard, explaining each step of the renewal process with as much clarity as he could muster. He described the storms that once threatened to uproot the orchard entirely, the old irrigation methods that failed to cope with erratic weather, and the partnership that introduced advanced drainage and soil monitoring. When the group saw the sensor arrays, the data streams, and the newly erected greenhouse, they seemed genuinely intrigued, peppering Ethan with questions about costs, scalability, and long-term viability. At times, Lily stepped in to handle more technical queries, referencing the careful notes she had compiled. Among the delegation was a tall, reserved individual who introduced himself as a professor from a major agricultural university. He appeared fascinated by the hybrid model Redwood Farm represented, noting how private investment, community support, and local expertise had merged to protect a traditionally vulnerable small farm. He hinted at publishing a paper on Redwood Farm's transformation, potentially showcasing it as a blueprint for rural revitalization. Ethan felt a swell of pride, mixed with caution. He had never aspired to academic acclaim. Redwood Farm was simply his family's land, a place he fought to save. Yet if sharing this story could help others, perhaps it was worth stepping out of his comfort zone. As the hours wore on, the delegation took photographs, inspected the greenhouse's automated venting systems, and marveled at the orchard's robust condition. A few individuals pressed Ethan on long-term financial projections, curious whether Redwood Farm could sustain itself once the corporate backing phased out. Ethan admitted he was still navigating those complexities, juggling loan terms, partnership obligations, and the unpredictable nature of farm income. He felt Lily's supportive glance, grateful he wasn't alone in trying to meet these demands. The delegation departed with a polite round of thanks, leaving Redwood Farm once again in relative quiet. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair, as Lily approached. They both recognized that Redwood Farm had crossed a threshold, no longer just a local concern but a model that drew interest from far beyond Redwood Valley. If the orchard was the heart of Redwood Farm, then perhaps it now beat for a wider community, farmers, researchers, and anyone seeking to merge tradition with innovation in an era of climate uncertainty. That evening, Ethan stood beneath a sky streaked with pink and gold, watching the orchard's leaves shift in the gentle breeze. He felt the presence of his ancestors, imagining them observing the orchard's high-tech lines and supportive structures. In that shared space between memory and progress, Redwood Farm carried on. The orchard itself seemed at peace, content in its role as the anchor of a story that spanned generations and now reached outward in unforeseen ways. Lily joined him, and they lingered there, saying little, both knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new rewards. The quiet rustle of leaves surrounded them, as if reminding them that Redwood Farm was alive, no longer endangered, no longer hidden in the shadows of looming debt, but shining as a place where old roots and new beginnings intertwined.